Get the hell out of the way, old man. What kind of idiot drives like that? The voice pierced the humid morning air like a whip cracking in Times Square. The cab jerked slightly as it halted at the curb, and the man who had yelled kicked the door open before the taxi had even come to a full stop. He stepped out in a rush, adjusting his tailored Italian blazer with a grimace on his face. His Rolex glinted in the sunlight as he slammed the car door shut. "You should have been a donkey driver back in your village," he sneered, turning back toward the driver. "This is New York City, not some third world dump." The taxi driver, a man in his late 60s, with a kind but tired face and deep lines etched into his cheeks, remained silent. He glanced up through the rearview mirror, his eyes briefly locking with the man's. They were calm, too calm. His name tag read, Amir. But the suited man was already storming off toward the towering glass lobby of Skybridge Financial Group. That man's name, Brandon Cole, Senior Vice President, Wall Street darling, a man who'd made his first million before turning 30 and spent every day since making sure the world knew it. Inside the building, Brandon walked like he owned the marble tiles beneath his feet, ignoring greetings from receptionists, interns, and even fellow executives. He stepped into the gold-trimmed elevator, alone, staring into the mirrored wall, fixing his slicked-back hair. "Idiots," he muttered to himself. "The city's full of them." He didn't know that someone had just witnessed the entire scene from across the street. Someone who had been standing quietly near a newspaper kiosk, sipping a black coffee and observing, unnoticed, that someone was Amir. 3 days later, Brandon was in full command of the 40 honest floor conference room. A panoramic view of Manhattan spread behind him as he prepped for the firm's annual Investor Power Brunch. The event was top tier, invitation only, and usually ended with a few signed deals worth hundreds of millions. "Brandon, you ready?" asked Angela, the firm's PR director, peeking into the room. "As I'll ever be. I was born for this stage," Brandon said, adjusting his color. Angela hesitated. "Oh, and quick heads up. The new majority shareholders attending today. No one's met him yet. He bought out the original board 2 weeks ago." Brandon's brow furrowed. "What? I thought Vance Holdings had controlling shares." "Not anymore. Some private buyer, self-made guy, apparently. Billionaire. He's kept a low profile." Brandon smirked. "Great. Another tech nerd with too much money and not enough class." Angela bit her lip but said nothing. The brunch began. Champagne flowed. Conversations buzzed around mergers and venture capital. Then the host's voice rose. "From the podium, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the man behind the new vision of Skybridge Financial, our majority shareholder and chairman, Mr. Amir Rahmani." Time stopped. Brandon, seated front and center, nearly dropped his glass, his jaw clenched. His eyes bulged. The taxi driver, walking toward the microphone in a perfectly fitted navy blue suit, no tie, polished brown shoes, was Amir, not driving a cab, not shouting in traffic, but commanding a room of Manhattan's most elite. "Good morning," Amir began, his voice calm, smooth, and laced with subtle authority. "Before we begin, I'd like to share a short story." Brandon shifted in his seat. "Years ago, I came to this city with $23 in my pocket and a degree no one cared about. I drove cabs for 2 decades. I listened to people, watched them. Some treated me like family. Others, well," Amir's eyes swept the room and they landed on Brandon directly, sharply. "Others thought I was beneath them, disposable, invisible." The room went still. And yet, while they were talking, I was building, investing, learning, quietly. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage. "Success isn't about stepping on others. It's about the journey. It's about how you treat people when you think no one is watching. Because someone always is." Murmurs rippled across the room. Amir's gaze never left Brandon. "Today, I own the company they work for. That's irony, or karma, or just New York." Soft laughter, Don and Shorda filled the room. Brandon was frozen, red creeping up his neck, hands clenched under the table. After the event, he forced himself to approach Amir. He extended a hand, Mr. Ramani, I didn't know. You didn't care, Amir interrupted, shaking his hand firmly. You assumed. Brandon swallowed hard. I was having a bad day. We all have bad days, Amir said. But character is shown when you think no one will remember. Brandon's voice was quiet. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Amir gave him a long look. Grow from it. And just like that, he turned and walked away, toward a group of world-class investors eager to shake his hand. Brandon stood alone in that bright, golden hallway, his ego cracked, his arrogance peeled away, and in that silence, he understood something for the first time. Money doesn't define power. Character does. Brandon couldn't sleep that night. The champagne had long worn off, and so had the illusion that he was untouchable. He lay awake in his penthouse suite, high above the city he once thought he ruled, staring at the ceiling with a heavy heart. He kept replaying that scene in his head, the way Amir had looked at him. Not with hatred, not even anger, just disappointment. It hit harder than any insult could have. He thought of his father, how he used to say, "You treat the janitor the same as the CEO, Brandon, because one day the janitor might be signing your paycheck." He had laughed it off then. Now it felt like prophecy. The next morning, Brandon walked into Skybridge Financial with less swagger than usual. He passed by the security guards he usually ignored and gave them a polite nod. They looked at him, surprised. Inside the elevator, he stood silently with the cleaning crew and said, "Morning." They nodded back, slightly confused but appreciative. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it can start in a moment. That moment had been Amir's story. A week later, Brandon requested a meeting with him. Not a business pitch, not a boardroom discussion, a real conversation. Amir agreed. They met at a small Lebanese cafe in the East Village. No cameras, no assistants, just two men. A pot of black tea between them. Brandon showed up in jeans and a plain shirt. No Rolex, no arrogance. "Thanks for meeting me," he said. Amir nodded. "I was curious." Brandon exhaled deeply. "I needed to say this properly. I've been a jerk for a long time. I came from a middle-class family, worked my way up fast, and somewhere along the line, I started thinking I was better than everyone. But I forgot where I came from." Amir stirred his tea. "You're not the first, won't be the last. I want to learn from you, not about money, about how to be a man of value, a real one." Amir studied him. "You sure about that?" Brandon nodded. "More than I've ever been sure about anything." There was a long pause. Then Amir smiled. "All right. First lesson, humility isn't weakness. It's power under control." Brandon smiled faintly. "Got it. And second," Amir said, leaning forward, "you're paying for the tea." Brandon laughed, a genuine, belly-deep laugh. It felt like the first real one in years. Over the next few months, something strange happened. Brandon changed. He started showing up at staff meetings early. He listened more than he talked. He started mentoring interns. He took the subway instead of his black car, and sometimes he'd sit beside taxi drivers at coffee shops and just talk. He told one of them, "You guys know more about the city than any CEO I've met." He began to understand something Amir had said at that brunch, that the way you treat those with no power reveals everything about the power you deserve. 6 months later, Skybridge announced a new leadership program for young immigrants, fully funded by the firm, spearheaded by Brandon. But he didn't slap his name on it. He called it the Amir Initiative. During the press conference, reporters asked Amir why he agreed to let Brandon lead it. Amir replied, "Because redemption is real, and so is growth. I saw a man who looked in the mirror and didn't like what he saw, so he broke the mirror and built a window instead." Brandon stood beside him, eyes wet but proud. A year later, Brandon was no longer known as the arrogant VP with the $1 million smile. He was the man who changed, who grew, who proved that even in the toughest cities, hearts can shift and men can rebuild their names, not with power, but with purpose. And sometimes, just sometimes, the man you scream at behind the wheel ends up being the one who teaches you how to steer your life right. It was a rainy Wednesday afternoon when Brandon found himself alone at the rooftop of Skybridge. looking over the city that used to feel like his empire. Now, it felt like something entirely different, something he was still learning how to respect. Behind him, the elevator dinged, and footsteps approached. "Thought I'd find you here," Amir said softly, holding a small umbrella over his head. "You always come up here when it rains." Brandon gave a half smile. "It's quieter. I think better when it's gray," Amir chuckled, joining him at the ledge. "You remind me of myself 20 years ago, restless, hungry, a little lost." Brandon looked over. "You were never arrogant like I was." "I was," Amir said, eyes distant, "in my own way. I hid it behind silence. You screamed it into every room. But we both had it. The belief that the world owed us something." Brandon was quiet for a long moment. "Did you always plan to buy the firm?" Amir shook his head. "No, I planned to survive. Then I planned to invest. Then one day I saw it was for sale, and I thought, what better lesson than to own the very world that once ignored me?" Brandon nodded slowly. "That day in the taxi, I was horrible to you." Amir looked over. "You were, but it was one day, one moment. You've shown me 1,000 better ones since." Brandon's eyes flicked up. "Do you really believe people can change? Deep down?" Amir's answer was immediate. "Yes, but only if they're willing to suffer through the discomfort of who they really are." Brandon breathed in sharply. "That's what I've been doing, suffering through it." "Good," Amir said. "That means you're alive." Over the next year, Brandon didn't just change on the surface, he rebuilt his life from the inside out. He began working weekends at the Initiative Center, personally interviewing young immigrants, helping them write resumes, prepping them for interviews. He drove out to Queens, Brooklyn, even Newark, sitting in modest homes with families who reminded him more and more of the father he had pushed away in his hunger for success. One night, he found himself sitting with a young man named Hassan, an engineering student from Syria. "I came here with my mother," Hassan said. "We had nothing. She cleans houses. I work night shifts at a warehouse, but I want to finish my degree. I just need someone to believe in me." Brandon looked him in the eye and said, "I do." That night, Brandon called Amir. "I want to personally sponsor Hassan's tuition, not the firm. Me, quietly." Amir smiled through the phone. "You already know what to do. That's progress." Months passed. And so did headlines. Ex-Wall Street bad boy turns mentor. From arrogance to altruism, the Brandon Cole reinvention. He didn't chase the praise, but it came anyway. Still, there was one thing he hadn't done yet: face his past where it began. It was a cold winter morning when Brandon hailed a cab from the Lower East Side. The driver was an older man, quiet, gentle, reminded him of Amir. Brandon sat in the back, watching the city blur by. At the end of the ride, he leaned forward. "Thank you, sir, for the ride." The driver blinked. "You okay, man?" Brandon smiled. "I am now." That afternoon, he visited his father's grave for the first time in 6 years. He knelt down, brushed snow off the nameplate, and whispered, "I'm sorry. You were right. I forgot who I was." He left a note. "I'm trying to be better for you, for me." Spring brought something unexpected. Amir, once unstoppable, began missing meetings, then emails. Then one day, Brandon found him sitting in his office, pale. "You all right?" Brandon asked. Amir looked up slowly. "Doctors say it's early-stage cancer. They're optimistic. But life reminds you, nothing is forever." Brandon's chest tightened. "What do you need?" Amir smiled faintly. "You. To take over the initiative, run it completely." "I thought I already was," Brandon said. "No," Amir said. "You were helping. Now, you lead it. It's yours." Brandon nodded, fighting tears. "I'll make you proud." Amir reached over, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You already have." Months passed. Amir fought hard. Brandon visited him every week. They sat on park benches, talked about life, politics, forgiveness. One day, Amir brought an old photo himself as a young man, standing beside a yellow cab. "That was me, the day before my daughter was born. I had no idea then that my pain would one day become my purpose." Brandon looked at the photo for a long time. You turned every insult into a foundation. That's power. Amir smiled. So can you. In late autumn, Amir passed away peacefully in his sleep. The city mourned. Articles flooded in. From cab to chairman, the legacy of Amir Rahmani. Brandon delivered the eulogy. He taught me that money doesn't measure success. Dignity does. Compassion does. He taught me that anyone, no matter how lost, can find their way back. A year later, the initiative had centers in 5 cities. Brandon personally hired dozens of young professionals who came from nothing, just like Amir. On the 10th anniversary of the initiative, Brandon stood on stage in a modest auditorium in Harlem. I was once the man who shouted at a taxi driver, he said, and that man became my mentor, my compass, my reminder that people are more than what they seem. The crowd rose in applause. After the event, a young girl approached him. Mr. Cole, she said shyly, do you think someone like me can run a company someday? Brandon knelt down, smiled gently. Not someday. Any day you choose. And when you do, make sure you're kind to your driver. She giggled. Deal. As he stood up and walked into the evening air, Brandon looked at the city lights not as conquests, but as stories, each one with a soul, a struggle, a chance to change. And for the first time, he no longer wanted to own the city. He wanted to serve it. He had once been the man who humiliated a stranger for no reason. Now, he was the man that stranger had believed in anyway. And that belief had changed everything. Forever. 5 years later, a bronze statue stood outside the newly renamed Rahmani Center for Leadership and Integrity. Nestled between 2 busy avenues in Midtown Manhattan, the statue depicted a man standing beside a taxi, one hand resting on the door, the other holding a briefcase, not a symbol of wealth, but of transition. Etched into the marble plaque below were Amir's words, "Success is not in the suit you wear, but in the lives you lift when no one's watching." Brandon stood before it, now in his 40s, wearing a simple navy blue sweater, gray slacks, and sneakers. He no longer needed the armor of wealth to feel powerful. His presence came from something deeper, earned respect, not demanded obedience. He turned as his assistant approached. "Sir, the board's waiting." "Shall I tell them you'll be a few minutes late?" Brandon glanced once more at the statue. "Tell them I'm exactly where I need to be." The boardroom waited, filled with men and women, some powerful, some just starting. On the wall hung portraits of the initiative's first 100 graduates. Each face told a story of survival, of dreams once deferred but finally realized. Brandon stepped to the head of the table, nodded to the room, and began, "Before we discuss projections and partnerships, I want to share something." The room leaned in. "I spent years building walls around myself. Money, arrogance, ego, brick by brick. I thought success was measured in silence from those below me. But the man who changed my life didn't own a tower. He drove a cab. And he did more for me in 5 minutes than any mentor ever had." He paused, breathing in the gravity of that truth. "Every face on that wall, you're here because someone believed in you. Someone who saw more than your shoes or your accent or your status. That's what this institution is built on, and it's what we protect every day." They applauded, not out of politeness, out of conviction. Later that evening, Brandon returned home to a modest brownstone in Brooklyn. Inside, there were no maids, no imported furniture, no towering wine racks, just warmth, shelves lined with books on leadership, psychology, finance, and compassion. Framed photos of initiative graduates. A small, framed picture of Amir stood near his desk. Beside a weathered taxi medallion, he sat, opened his journal, something he'd started the day after Amir's funeral, and began writing. March 12th. Hassan just got promoted to lead architect at Green and Flint. He called me crying. Said none of it would have happened without the first job we offered him. I told him he had it in him the whole time. I just reminded him where to look. Amir would have been proud. I miss him today more than ever. The world moves fast, but his wisdom still echoes. I still think of that day. He paused. That day. The day he slammed a taxi door and walked away from a man he believed had nothing to offer. The day that began everything. He closed the journal and stared out the window. The city lights blinked in the distance, pulsing like memories. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. "Unknown number," he answered. "Mr. Cole." "Yes. My name is Samira Rahmani. I'm Amir's daughter." Brandon straightened. "Samira, wow. It's an honor. I've been following your work, the initiative, the graduates, the programs. My father spoke of you often before he passed." Brandon's throat tightened. "I owe him everything." There was a pause on the line. "He left something for you. A letter. We never knew who it was meant for until a few months ago, when we found your name in his old journal." He called, "Youth man who chose the light, even after walking through shadow. Would you like to receive it?" Brandon's eyes filled with tears. "I'd be honored." A week later, a small envelope arrived, cream-colored, handwritten. Inside was a single page, in Amir's firm, graceful script. "Brandon, if you're reading this, then you became the man I always knew you could be. You once asked if people can change. They can. But the true test is whether they help others change too. You've done that. You've turned your guilt into purpose, your past into power. Remember, the world needs less noise and more integrity. Be the example, always your friend." Amir Rahmani. Brandon held the letter to his chest and closed his eyes. He didn't need applause anymore, or headlines, or fancy cars. He had a purpose. He had peace. And from that day forward, every time he stepped into a taxi, he looked the driver in the eye, shook their hand, and said, "Thank you for everything you do," because he knew he would never forget. 1 year later, on the 10th anniversary of the Amir Initiative, Brandon stood at the entrance of a newly opened training center in Chicago, its glass doors reflecting a skyline Amir once dreamed of visiting. The event was small, intimate, just as Amir would have wanted. Inside, a group of young immigrants and first-generation college students waited anxiously, some clutching notepads, others simply holding on to hope. Before cutting the ribbon, Brandon addressed the crowd. 10 years ago, I thought success was stepping over people on your way to the top. I mistook volume for vision. But a man who drove a taxi taught me that real success is measured not by the towers we build, but by the hands we extend. A young woman raised her hand. "Was it really true that you yelled at him in his cab?" Brandon smiled with a mix of pain and humility. "Yes, I treated him like he was nothing, but he saw something in me anyway. Not because I deserved it, but because he believed in the power of change." The room was silent, a kind of reverent quiet where something more than words passed between them. Recognition, inspiration, the belief that they too could turn pain into purpose. After the ceremony, Brandon walked through the halls of the new center. On the walls were framed photos of alumni, doctors, lawyers, artists, community leaders. Near the back, he found a corner he hadn't known about, a tribute wall. At the center was a photo of Amir standing beside his taxi, his eyes kind but commanding. Below it, etched into the marble, was the quote from Amir's last letter: "Turn your guilt into purpose, your past into power." Brandon's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Hassan, now leading an engineering firm in Seattle. "We're opening our first internship program for Initiative Kids next month. It's finally happening." He smiled. Another text came through, this one from a woman named Lucia, who Brandon had helped 4 years earlier when she was undocumented and struggling to find work. Now, she was a paralegal. She wrote, "Thank you for seeing me when the world didn't. I've applied to law school. Wish me luck." He replied, "You don't need luck. You've got fire. Keep going." Later that night, back in his hotel room, Brandon sat by the window, writing in the journal he never stopped carrying. March 9th, another city, another center. Another story, written into the legacy of a man who saw through my worst moment and offered me a second chance. Amir, your name is on the building, but your heart is in every smile I see when someone realizes they matter. I used to run from humility. Now I chase it. It feels like coming home. The next day, Brandon visited the local college that partnered with the initiative. After speaking to a lecture hall full of young students, one boy approached him nervously. "Mr. Cole, my father's a cab driver. Sometimes he comes home so tired, and people treat him like garbage. It makes me angry. But you make me think, maybe there's more." Brandon knelt down slightly so he was eye level with the boy. "There's always more, but it starts with you. Treat your father like a hero because he is. Then treat everyone else with that same respect. That's how you change the world." The boy nodded fiercely, like he'd just been given the map to his future. On the flight back to New York, Brandon sat in coach beside a middle-aged woman who didn't recognize him at first. She asked what he did. He smiled. "I help people remember who they are." She blinked. "Like a therapist?" Brandon laughed. "No, just someone who's been reminded of his own humanity." When the plane landed, Brandon grabbed his own bag, nodded to the flight attendants, and stepped into the cool night air. As he waited by the curb, a yellow cab pulled up. The driver, a man in his 50s, with kind eyes, rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" Brandon smiled. "Absolutely." He got in, sat quietly in the back, watching the city lights. After a few blocks, he leaned forward. "Sir, I just want to say thank you for what you do, for being out here, night after night." The driver looked surprised, then grinned. "Not every day a passenger says that. You have no idea how much it means." Brandon nodded. "Actually, I think I do." And as the cab turned down Fifth Avenue, he looked out the window, not at the towering buildings, but at the small lights in corner shops. The tired workers locking up for the night, the doormen saying quiet goodbyes. He saw the city again, not as a playground for the powerful, but a home for the brave. Because once upon a time, a man in a taxi saw a lost soul drowning in his own ego and offered him a lifeline. And Brandon Cole would spend the rest of his life doing the same for others. One ride, one voice, one second chance at a time.